Good evening. Pardon me. I'm used to the cart intro. Michael's here this evening, and I'll get right on the air without the other cart that we usually use. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 477 for those of you that subscribe to them, and it's January 25th, 1981. I have to apologize for my guest last week. I'd been going back and forth to Los Angeles the past 3 weeks because of illness. My parents and my father had surgery on Monday. Being 90 years old, I wanted to be there when he went to the hospital, so I took the plane Sunday afternoon. I was going to stay here and do the program, and I thought I just should get on to L.A., and that was a decision I made after I talked to Bill Casing, who has done many radio shows and TV shows, wrote the book, We Never Went to the Moon, and he assured me that he had a lot of preparation and would give you a good broadcast. And when he was in the room here for 10 minutes, he started to pass out and faint, and KLRB turned on music, and he came in asking my daughter and one of the disc jockeys here to ask him questions. They weren't familiar with his book or with the space program, and it seems that the preparation needed for this kind of broadcast was not done. And those of you that get the tape or listen and wonder what in the heck was going on, I thought I had it in the hands of competence. I have never missed a broadcast in 9 years. When I would go camping in Canada or go to New York, I've made tapes in advance and had my program set with the station and have never handed the program over to somebody. But in this case, with this kind of illness, I thought Bill Casing could cover it. He said he would. And please accept my apologies for whatever went on that spent your time that wasn't of interest, and I hope that some of it was of interest to you. I haven't heard the tape yet. I haven't got the courage to get into that yet. The interim of my parents having the flu and pneumonia, surgery, both of them sick, at the same time kept me busy, and it was a good time not to be concerned with the inauguration or the hostages. One of my worst fears for the past 8 years was the realization that someday Ronald Reagan would be made president of the United States. And being as I've done many years of research on Reagan and the people that he's putting into his cabinet and the people that pushed him into office, I think if I had stayed here, I would have been very frustrated and upset. It was a good time for me to have my mind on other matters. My niece at the dinner table the other evenings referred to the Iranians as barbarians when they left the soil there and said that they had been, in quotes, mistreated, the worst being the one who tried to escape. The others didn't have it so bad. And I asked her, do you think the Savak were barbarians? And she said, who are they? This is she married my nephew around 25 years old, and I cannot stand this kind of stupidity. When people have an opinion, it should be based on what they read or books and not mouthing these words that the media gives you. If you understand the CIA and what they did in Iran and Mossadegh and the torture and the shooting down of students or controlling the food supply and exploiting an entire population for the multinational corporations, specifically Morgan Trust or Chase Manhattan for profit, and keeping people a form of slavery, not educating it at home, not building up schools and so forth. And these hostages came home alive. And I think that says a lot for the situation and for keeping things at a stalemate so they at least could return. And these terms, such as barbarians, are for stupid people. I don't think it was right to take them, and I've done many broadcasts on the hostages when they were taken. But it wasn't right that we were there, and when we do something wrong, we can expect a counter-reaction on their part. That's very simple, and what form it takes, we are never going to know. The Iranians could have bombed the entire American fleet out in the Gulf over there and pulled at Pearl Harbor. They're home, and instead of being grateful that they are home alive, we're using it as a propaganda tool to further our interests, our particular interests in the Middle East. Pardon me if my throat is hoarse. I think I picked up the flu from the folks, and I came in with some temperature tonight, but I wouldn't leave you two weeks in a row at KLRB without being sure I was on the air, and hopefully I'll be here every Sunday night. I want to ask one question before I get into some other material here. Where is David Rockefeller when the president is inaugurated? I don't remember seeing David Rockefeller on the rostrum in past inaugurations, and I have to look up the books on Richard Nixon's inauguration. We have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and where does David Rockefeller fit in? He stays in the background and selects the presidents, such as Jimmy Carter, or the vice presidents, such as George Bush, and many of the Rockefeller people are wining and dining the Reagans right now. But where do they fit, the Rockefeller family, into the inaugurations, and why aren't they visible? There was a movie on Channel 28 or Channel 9 up here, Bill Moyer, on the Bilderbergers, and they show David Rockefeller arriving as literally the king of the United States, Mr. Big of the entire world. Is he too big to come to a presidential inauguration, and is he above either party that he just continuously selects the candidates for us and manipulates in the background? Let me know if you saw any pictures of him at this inauguration. I wasn't aware that he was there. Ronald Reagan speech when he was inaugurated began this way, the second paragraph. The orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Now, this 4-year ceremony that took place in 1960, when John Kennedy was killed in 1963, Robert Kennedy was killed before the 1968 elections, Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered, and all of the people involved and around the Ted Kennedy debacle and the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne were later exposed at Watergate and never put on the stand or investigated, such as E. Howard Hunt, Tony Lasowitz, the Cubans, the assassination teams of the Republican Party. And we also had no investigation of the murder of Nelson Rockefeller that made Ronald Reagan's presidency possible. If there's anything that makes me puke, it's the accolades of the way the system works. The system works if you survive the bullets. Now we have George Bush, vice president, former director of the CIA. Now the orderly process will no doubt be interrupted before the 4 years are over. Ronald Reagan and the politicians praise the political process. The process only works when other people who would be president, such as Howard Taft or Adlai Stevenson, people that work their way up, are murdered and moved aside so that a specific hand-picked team get on a conveyor belt, and no matter who's in their way, they end up being the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan is part of that conveyor belt, and he finally made it, and I hope the news media and CBS, NBC, Associated Press, the whole schmear, I hope they're happy with him, because now that they've got him, they've got to live with him, and they also have to face certain facts about Ronald Reagan's past, where he came from, who his cabinet people are, and the conflicts. For example, the moral majority versus the mob entertaining and hosting and working with Ronald Reagan. Somebody called me this evening before I went on the air and brought out that fact. Mr. Falwell doesn't like mobsters or organized crime around the White House. They're trying to fight pornography, child prostitution, narcotics, breaking up families, gambling, and so forth. So Reagan is split in the middle, and we have to watch him torn apart little by little, and I don't think it will be too hard to do. He wanted it. He got it. He said the oath, and as I said, I'm glad I was away caring for my parents the best I could and didn't have to listen to all that brahu on the television and radio. I spent a lot of time at the airport the last 3 weeks, going back and forth to LA every week and coming up here for the weekends, and my mother had at the table next to her bed the article I wrote for The Realist in 1974. That was 7 years ago now. My second article on the Senate Select Committee as part of the cover-up. And I wanted to index the articles I wrote for Paul Krasner. One of the projects I wanted to do is republish those articles in a book, along with other articles I've written. So I started to the airport and indexing certain facts that I wrote a long time ago. And in there I talked about the plans to kill the president of Panama, taking over the narcotics operations called Operation Intercept, the use of Richard Nixon's plumber team for crises through his life that involved counterintelligence. And the important thing is that these people's names are so closely linked to the Ronald Reagan administration that you could just take the name Watergate off or Nixon, and as I said before, it goes on and on. I wrote at that time, if Richard Nixon moves out of office, Agnew moves in, and Reagan will follow him. And I've mentioned that to you before because I talked about the narcotic war, and the week before last I talked about that book on heroin and fascism that had just come out. And 7 years ago I wrote that the war in Asia will escalate after the elections. This is in 1974, right after Richard Nixon was in. The Middle East is waiting for their U.S.-fomented war next. A Democratic president could have changed the course of history, not proving they would, but there's more profit in bombings and building airplane or parts for warfare. There's more profit distributing and importing narcotics, and that the CIA transports them, and that the drug traffic from Asia involves more billions than military profits. This article, as I was indexing it, goes to Casper the Axe Weinberger and how he was slashing domestic programs. And as I say, the names run through then as now. Robert Vesco, who was working with Bill Casey, had him under salary, and Casey's now in the cabinet of Ronald Reagan, and how he was working with Edward Nixon, the brother of the president. And I also wrote about the dangers of Alexander Haig, who only had a 5-day hearing and without the tapes was sworn in. I wrote about the martial law without the riots, about William Timmons, who's again on the staff of Ronald Reagan, who was with Richard Nixon as part of a White House espionage group. And I wrote about Roy Ash of Litton Industries, who was one of the big people behind Ronald Reagan, who helped put military junta in power in Greece and in the United States. And I also wrote then General Haig said he didn't give up his military career to shuttle papers. He intends to shuffle us instead, and wrote about Haig and said there is indication that the military and the intelligence agencies will be operating, and that Haig and others do not put ends far above the means. Now, Alexander Haig said this last week that there's matters more important than war, and he wouldn't think twice about going to war in the Middle East. And I listed the institutions that should be dismantled, and of course they're more powerful than ever. The Office of Management Budget, the Office of Emergency Service, and I wrote that Ronald Reagan, who hopes to be president, is pushing hard in California for the Office of Emergency Service for means to control us, and that the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Drug and Law Enforcement Agency, is similar to Nazi Germany, and they import narcotics on CIA planes and use the federal government for their profits of narcotics and so forth. I'm trying to think about, as I say, index this, and I started to do this and separate the names so that when you study the current times and the Reagan administration, you can have access to the articles I've written and see how long ago it was perfectly obvious that these characters would be placed in the positions they're in. I wrote about planted marijuana in the binoculars of John Lennon as an excuse to deboard him, and how he was an outspoken critic of warfare, genocide, and political prisoners in the United States. And by planting this narcotic, they could get rid of him. And I wrote about the mind control programs that Ronald Reagan wanted and instituted at UCLA as a means of controlling people's brains and their lives, their ability to reason. And also I warned about General Alexander Haig, who was then chief of staff in the White House, who passed over 243 generals for his promotion, and the danger of Clarence Kelly, who then was director of the FBI, who is now working with the Wackenhut Corporation in Florida, and a very dangerous outfit linked to Germany, Argentina, South America, and so forth. So what I want to do in the next year, if I have time, is to index the sheets that go with these tapes for the past 3 years that keep coming out with each tape. Index those and publish those just as a source of information. I get letters all the time asking about the facts of the Pope at Auschwitz or the murder of Nelson Rockefeller. If I take those sheets and index them and sell them, then people can look up the references if they don't have the tapes, or even if they have them, and get the newspapers and dates and articles themselves. I asked Bill Casing last week to mention the Johnny Meyer story that came out of the Vancouver Sun. He had a press conference. You notice it wasn't in any single paper that I read, but I didn't read too many going back to L.A. this past week. Maybe you've seen it, and if you found it in a local paper, send it to me. This is from the Vancouver Sun, January the 16th, 1981. Johnny Meyer will tell on the CIA. He claimed that documents that were forged had been planted on him. He was before a case in Utah, and he presented documents saying that the judge was in the pocket of the Summa Corporation. Johnny says they were planted among other documents, and he went to jail for that. The Summa Corporation is the Howard Hughes organization. But he said that the CIA had control of the Hughes organization and that Howard Hughes was not buried in Texas. As I say, I asked Bill Casing to share this with you, but I don't know yet if he did or if that was the time period where he actually freaked out. And he claimed that he was a political prisoner in Utah, similar to the hostages in Iran, and that he would reveal the agency's control of the Hughes organization and that Hughes was not buried in Texas. The important thing about the Howard Hughes story, or whether Lee Harvey Oswald, or the important persons of history whose graves, it seems, are empty or filled with somebody else, is not only the fact that these people aren't in those graves, but who is there, who is actually kidnapped and put there, what kind of subterfuge takes place where another person is even possibly buried in that place and not allowed to have the freedom to yell out or speak out. Who is doing this manipulation, and how often has it take place, and who's in the grave? Later, I'll refer to a new book called The Search of the Lindbergh Baby. The fact, it's a new book by Tower paperback, that the Lindbergh baby is still alive in New England. And at one time, at the course of the trial of Bruno Hauptmann, they believed that he was lying, that there were more people involved in the kidnapping of the baby, and there was reason to believe the baby was, in fact, alive. I have a book printed in 1950, that's 31 years ago, on this subject. And one way to get Hauptmann to talk, he got the electric chair for killing this baby. He claimed that he was innocent and didn't do it. One way they got him to talk was to take a lawyer in New York City and kidnap him and put him in an estate far away from everywhere and torture him and put him spread eagle and electricity on his testicles and on the back of his neck, light bulbs, and they burned him and tortured him until he confessed that he did the kidnapping. They thought if they went to Hauptmann and said this man confessed, then Hauptmann would relax and break the case. And so when they went to court for him to confess, the men weren't experts at mind control, but they were New York City policemen, and he charged them with kidnapping and torture. But had he died and been put in another grave for somebody else to cover this up, what would the circumstances be then? Who would they put, whose grave would they use? And the case of Johnny Meyer saying Howard Hughes isn't in that grave, and I don't believe that is Howard Hughes, has been passed off by the major news media for a long, long time. I wrote in Playgirl in 1974 that Howard Hughes had died much earlier and that the CIA and the FBI used the Howard Hughes name to control what I think is the Nazification of America, fascism in America, the assassination teams in America, and that there's nobody to speak up, because the money can come from the Hughes organization, just as Robert Mayu set up assassinations from the Hughes organization, and there's nobody to control the money going in or out, or who is being paid to torture or kidnap people to put in graves when the people that we believe are in those graves are not there. There's an article in 1977, that's 4 years ago, New York Times, New Mystery, Misplaced Millions of Dollars from Howard Hughes' Empire. In Wilmington, Delaware, $600 million in cash went out before he had passed away, and there was no accounting for the money. $65 million from 1966 to 1967. There was $800 million total and $142 in cash, and they found out that $600 million, just before they cashed in that other body, was gone. Now, were they paying, who were they paying, and were these dollars going to assassination teams for payoffs, for killing? There were memos to suggest that $1 million was taken to Lyndon Johnson, and the Hughes Empire gave another $1 million to Richard Nixon. These were the allegations of various memos. Pardon me. So Lyndon Johnson certainly was a part of the Kennedy assassination, and Richard Nixon has been implicated through that and other assassinations, the Chappaquiddick, the Robert Kennedy. He became the heir when LBJ decided not to run. And you get $600 million here and $600 million there, and we've talked about the missing money. Not only are the bodies not showing up and allegations that they're not there, but it takes hundreds of millions of dollars to swing these kinds of operations. I always said that start exhuming these graves and find out who's really there, and then trace the chain of command, even though some are dead, of who did the autopsies, who identified the bodies, and carry it, if necessary, all the way up to the White House. That's where it would go, but it would be an easy way to solve some of these crimes. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times this last week by Robert Schetzel, Schaetzel. Interesting article on control, which goes back to the Hughes Empire the CIA used as a cover. And this article is the first one that I've really seen that brings up the point that the National Security Council has usurped the right of our Constitution. And I've said many, many times, we had a triangle, a balance of power between the legislative, executive, judicial. And this article said at the end of World War II, a mechanism was set up that involved what we called national security, political and security affairs, and the national security advisors, such as Henry Kissinger and such as Brzezinski, tell Congress what we need to be safe, that they're controversial memos that Congress has no control of. And Congress doesn't even pass over the appointment of the National Security Advisor. The Secretary of State is passed or voted by the Congress, but not the National Security Advisor. And this article says to have sequentially Kissinger and Brzezinski in the role of National Security Advisor risks planting in the American government an organizational virus that could affect future administrations. The controversial Presidential Directive 59 on nuclear strategy is one example where the National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, excludes Muskie and his aides. And the article, as I say, is one of the first I've seen where the National Security Advisor can go on the border of Afghanistan, make statements about war, about going to war, that are totally out of the Congress, that are advised by these people. And I believe that the Howard Hughes organization that Johnny Meyer says is the CIA has set the framework for these kinds of subterfuge that negate the way the Constitution was written for us a long time ago. It can't hold up if the advisors make the decisions and tell the elected officials what is in the best interest of the United States according to them. There's an article by David Broder in the Los Angeles Times the end of December. Already worry of a manipulated Reagan. this goes into to what extent does Reagan run the show? Does he know what's going on? And it goes into the transition teams and the appointments, and that Reagan isn't even a part of them, that Reagan is absent. He's absent when the controversial William Simon was suggested for a position, or Donald Reagan, or Alexander Haig, or Jackie Presser of organized crime. And it gives a list of Richard Allen and Ed Meese and the people behind him, and it says it's not clear that Reagan is using this team, that the team is using him. And, of course, that's the way the puppet is going to be manipulated. There's another article this morning in the paper, Associated Press, Reagan's cabinet looks like a millionaire's club. And it goes into all of the various millionaires, Bill Brock, who has $10 million or more. And it goes on and lists all the other millionaires, William Casey with $3 to $5 million that he talks about, William French Smith with $2 to $5 million, Caspar Weinberg with $2 to $4 million, and almost every member of his cabinet, Labor Secretary designate Donovan, who's been linked to the mob in New Jersey, to at least his property assets, $2 to $3 million, and John Block, property assets from $3 to $4 million, and so forth. This is a very select cabinet of people who bypassed the necessity of housing, health, safety. For the most part, they've accumulated in the American system tremendous wealth while they're going to push warfare budgets and cut back, if they can, the domestic programs, the people that do the labor, that pick the food that they eat, that do the services for them, that collect their garbage, the crippled, the maimed, and so forth. They're going to cut back their benefits, put private corporations into running hospitals for more private money and capital. And this is something we're going to have to look forward to, is that people removed from the needs of society are in the swing now, and they're certainly not going to lose money in their offices. Men like Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter will be millionaires. The others are. Carter's will come flowing in. The former presidents become multi-millionaires because of the contacts, and I'm sure the payoffs for what they have done. I mentioned that book, The Great Heron Coup, and when I talked about it several weeks ago, I didn't have a chance to give you one quotation. Many of you people have the book, but there was one quotation that about sums up the work that I've done, and I don't think I read it with you on the air. When he writes about the drug enforcement agencies and the CIA and so forth, this author said, "We cannot discount the possibility the unofficial policy is executed by former agents who once were in the CIA and left the CIA and now run their independent secret service, aided by lobby interests, very wealthy people such as Intertel," and that's the group that took the alleged Howard Hughes body out of Vegas that wasn't there. It says they're backed by the World Anti-Communist League. They mobilize CIA agents. They work with the Cuba, Chile, China lobby, set up by Reinhard Gehlen. He was chief of Hitler's intelligence, and the Vaslov army. Those are all the people that worked with Marina Oswald and Lee in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Led by master spy Reinhard Gehlen, the West German equivalent of the CIA. He's the head of the BND. Now, this one paragraph in the book just about summarizes what he calls a renegade group headed by the Gehlen operation. And then he goes on the next page to support his belief that there could be former CIA people headed by Hitler's chief of intelligence who are renegades. The difference of opinion that I have with this author in the book, The Great Heron Coup, is that all of our government agencies have worked and were formed by Reinhard Gehlen. He set up the National Security Council from 1945 to 1947. And what you see in oppression or using food as a weapon or arming nations all over the world for future genocide or slavery, the blueprint was put in by Gehlen's men. He tightened up these agencies and created them so that the pain and suffering that we see will only come by understanding Galen and hopefully overthrowing what they do through resistance and social movements. It's 10:30 now. We're going to take a 1-minute break, and I'll come back on the air with some more information about assassinations and conspiracies that are in the news this week.
Going to give you a quick ID. This is KLRB Carmel. Be back with more World Watchers International with Mae Brussell after this.
I'm so
Getting back to the subterfuge of the Howard Hughes body that is in the grave, I've referred many times on this program to the show Good Morning America. It was December 15, 1976, 5 years ago, ABC TV, where it was said before David Hartman that Vance Cooper is buried in the Texas grave, and it's not Howard Hughes. And I never can figure out why people don't ask, well, who is it then? What is going on? Grant Greenspun, the publisher of the Las Vegas Sun, was also on television, and this was right after the Hughes body was cashed in 1976. And he said on the TV show, which I taped and typed up, he said Howard Hughes was one of the great despoilers of our political system. And if he were permitted to go unrestrained, he would have destroyed the government, which he helped make. And if that wasn't used, then the despoiling is going on. If the people who have had the power haven't been checked, then the same system is being destroyed, of the political system, and I believe it is. He went on, Dan Greenspun, he was talking, he said, they may say that we're walking on a man's grave because Hughes' body had just been cashed in, or that was Vance Cooper's, but this man has to be explored. We have to get to the bottom and find out all the evils that befall our form of government. It should be a framework for future generations not to get trapped in. We must protect what we have here. Just as you have to watch the political system, the same methods have to be employed where you have this extraordinary wealth, overwhelming wealth, that it influences the political system and undermines it to agree where the whole system can collapse. We must examine Howard Hughes because he was the arch corrupter of the political system, and we must keep re-examining him over and over again, whether he's alive or whether he's dead. And that is the only reason I bring this up, because the public must be aware of the hold this man had on the government of the United States. Now, this was a program, April 25th, 1976, Hank Greenspan said that. And the man that Howard Hughes, the non-existent Hughes, whoever the organization is and was, and it is the CIA and it was the CIA, selected Paul Laxalt as their president of the United States. But Paul Laxalt is very active in the Senate, and he ran Ronald Reagan's campaign. He's the man that was with him in every city, every state, every speech, and he's the liaison from Congress to the President of the United States. So Paul Laxalt should be exposed because he also told people, and Jack Anderson wrote about it, and I've mentioned this many times, that he didn't think Hughes was in Vegas, but he gave them the right to buy these nightclubs which have extensive skimming money and unlimited money, again, to buy guns and narcotics and various methods of control for politicians to come through. So if Paul Laxalt were not in the White House right now as the advisor to the President of the United States, if he didn't manage his campaign, if he wasn't the selected agent of whoever buried Vance Cooper in Texas, then what do they have in mind with Paul Laxalt? And shouldn't he be put under question about how the governor of the state of Nevada, he allowed the subterfuge of a man named Hughes not even being there, taken away by Intertel that took off all the clubs, the Vegas clubs there that Hughes had, flew this double or body out, which is literally kidnapping, took it different countries, and then buried this other person. everyone who had a finger in that is responsible for what's going to happen to us in the future. And the only way to solve the problems of the future, I believe, the only ways are to follow, say, open the grave and trace it around and find out why Powell, Oswald, and Intertel and these people used a non-existent use as the cover for what they were doing. And was their cover Mr. Reagan? And why should we get a man hoisted on us who doesn't belong there? When Johnny Meyer had this press conference in Vancouver, I called the White House because I got that news on a Friday night, the Vancouver Sun paper, and I called the White House this Saturday, and they said nobody is there. And I said, I would like to speak to a secretary of the President of the United States. This is the weekend before the inauguration. They said nobody takes messages. I said, I know he's at Camp David, but you don't have any secretary, no press secretary, no Secret Service. If there were a plan to kill Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, there's nobody. They said, call back on Monday. Nobody takes a message at the White House on the weekend. So that is the way it was before this president took the oath of office, and I don't think he should have had that oath of office. If Laxalt and Intertel and those people with such subterfuge had to go through this extent to put him in, do we have to take what he dishes out to us as if he were the legitimate president of the United States? All the other candidates and past presidents had been murdered. That made the way for the conveyor belt, and I think that we have a right to know how much subterfuge is going on. A mother died this last week, Oswald's mother, just last Sunday. It was January the 19th, actually. She passed away. She was in a hospital. Nobody knew she was there. She was admitted. It was secret. The press, no family. Nobody knows how she expired. They said she died of cancer, but so did Jack Ruby. He had 3-week cancer, and so did Martha Mitchell. She claimed until her death that her son did not kill the President of the United States. He was a decoy. He was in a building and agreed to leave, but he didn't shoot a rifle or have a rifle, and I always agreed with her. She said she had been victimized, that she knew that her son had never been a part of the assassination, the actual shooting or the firing. She said he was an undercover agent, a double agent, and she was isolated by the researchers, and that's one of the things I never understood. She said he was an agent for the CIA and for the FBI in the Soviet Union, and that he was framed because he knew in advance that John Kennedy was going to be killed, and he informed the FBI. He did go to the Western Union and sent a wire, but the name Oswald was going to be used in Chicago, and it was also set up that there would be a patsy similar to this with the plans to kill John Kennedy in Miami a few weeks earlier. She tried desperately to stop the exhuming of Oswald's body. Marina Oswald wants it. As you know, Marina Oswald has said, I've kept silent for 17 years, and I'm 99% sure that Oswald isn't there. Marguerite, and I've mentioned this many times, was quiet about the fact if Oswald had left the Dallas-Fort Worth area or whether or not he was in that grave. But she wanted to clear his name of being the assassin of John Kennedy. And very tragically, she died in a hospital with no writers, researchers, or people that could speak with her. And goodness knows how long her cancer was with her. She claimed that she was followed all over wherever political figures were, and that her house was bugged and that she was under surveillance. Penn Jones in Texas once said to me that he believed that the accident in our family that took place December 1970 could have been a result of my going to Texas and being in the home of Mrs. Oswald, meeting her and sharing information with her. I have many letters from her and correspondence through the years, and when we stayed at a motel in Texas near her home, after we checked in, a man stood outside with a cars where and cracked a bullwhip almost all night, and we went to another motel the next day, but we were under surveillance, and everybody who met with Marguerite Oswald was under surveillance, and we were very aware of that at the time. She died January the 19th, 1981, and the book of David Lifton's was reviewed January 19th, 1981. There are very many deaths of people just at the time that a new book or information is coming out. Time magazine has a 2-page article on now a 2-casket argument, and it has to do with David Lifton's book, Best Evidence. David, I mentioned him briefly one evening, and I just received the book when I was away in L.A., and I came back. David sent me a copy of the book, and I'll be reading it very carefully because there's a lot of interest in that book for all of us to read. He is a very precise researcher, a good researcher, and although he may have disclaimers to a larger conspiracy that I've mentioned before, what he has is good, and this is an interesting fact that the Book of the Month Club has taken it as a selection, and I hope you'll all read it. I received from a listener a article about the book and some documents in the book, and a long article from Dallas Morning News, January the 11th, 1981. Referring to the book, there's a memo of Dr. James Hughes. He did the autopsy of John Kennedy that was so controversial, the Navy commander at Bethesda Hospital. And this document came 4 months after Oswald was buried, and so in the book there are parts of the double Oswalds, and that is the book that I have done 17 years research and want to put together very shortly. I was hoping January the 1st I could speed in. The book is done and all the research is finished, and add to that and finish that book. But to add to it, in the book Best Evidence, there's much reference to, again, the possibility of exhuming Oswald. This isn't the double coffin that he writes about with John Kennedy. David's book has a memo from Mr. Slauson, an attorney. He teaches law at UCLA, and it has to do with exhuming Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think that's interesting that the Warren Commission wanted to exhume Oswald. The memo calls attention to the fact that they were curious about suicide scars on the arm of Lee Harvey Oswald, and the autopsy didn't show those scars, and the Warren Commission in April considered exhuming him, and according to this Dallas paper, the CIA was in favor of it, but J. Edgar Hoover wasn't. I think the CIA plants certain documents to their own interest. I don't think the CIA is any clinger than J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. They were all involved in the assassination, but they knew that J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't approve and was reluctant to exhume Oswald, and therefore they could say, well, we wanted it, but he didn't. Now, in April of 1964, this crazy diary of Lee Harvey Oswald's appeared. It was a planted diary. It was a forged diary. It was presented to Henry Luce in Life magazine by Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission. And in June 1964, Gerald Ford was meeting with people from Time and Life magazine and the Luce organization. And if you want to look up the diary of Lee Harvey Oswald, it's in Life magazine, July the 10th, 1964. The original diary was never seen, but this diary had a lot of misspelling and a lot of sayings that Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't possibly have written. But among the effort to make him look like a total idiot who couldn't spell or think, it goes into what was supposed to be a suicide attempt in Russia. Well, the diary was planted and forged, and the body didn't show the wrist on it. So one of the necessities for exhuming the body and getting rid of it was, at that time, that the body didn't have the suicide marks on it that the planted diary talked about and the autopsy report didn't show. Remember, I've read on the program the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings where Earl Warren said in January of 1964, we better exhume that body and cremate it because there's something on that body and the nation couldn't stand another shock. Well, one of the important pieces of evidence to lend the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty was going to be this great diary. I don't know where it exists, never fingerprinted, never really seen. The Warren Commission was given, in quotes, a copy of it. But the chain of command was this ridiculous telltale diary of about a suicide, and the body buried in Texas didn't have the scars, and the FBI didn't have them. So they had to reconcile the body they had with the diary, which involved Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, Nicholas Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, now big executive for IBM. These were big league lawyers from the top down, along with Gerald Ford, who was to become President of the United States, and Leon Jaworski, who was on the Warren Commission and investigated the Koreagate and the Senate Watergate hearings. The top dogs of the country were playing around with all kinds of planted and forged evidence and the wrong bodies. So they were going to have this cremated. But the memo that's described in the Dallas newspaper, Sunday, January the 11th, talks about the discussion of exhuming Oswald after 4 months. Everything that the Warren Commission did was a hot potato, and they had to cover the evidence with their story, and this is the way the great government agents work. One of the most disgusting things is that Mr. Slauson was asked about the memos he sent and about exhuming Oswald, and he had a comment that was in the newspaper. That was 17 years ago, and if I said it, but I'm not interested, and he passed it off. He's a professor of law at UCLA, and he's saying now, I don't even want to listen to what I wrote about in 1964. Well, I've been doing this research since November 1963, and I would like to know what I wrote or said and compare it with the evidence, see if it stands up, which the research has stood up to, and he should be responsible. And this excuse, a law professor now saying, oh, don't bother me, that was 17 years ago, is inexcusable. He ought to be kicked off the faculty. It's a state university, and we pay his salary, and this kind of incompetence should be totally removed from the scene. But no, he'll go on to a new young generation of law students, and they'll say, this is the prestigious teacher who taught you law, probably criminal law he's teaching there, wouldn't you want to bet, investigative law or evidence or prosecution or whatever. Goodness knows what he is teaching in the university. And at the time that he had this case in his hands, he had memos about exhuming, and they had evidence that the body was ordered to be cremated, and anything that important, it's really hard to believe that 17 years later, he doesn't know what's going on. But this was one of the hot potatoes the Warren Commission had all along. There's an interesting article this week in anticipation of what the future Reagan administration will be. It's called A King and Wizard in Waiting, and it's by Mike Weiss. It was in the LA Times. It's about one of my very favorite people. It's the San Francisco Chronicle, January 19th. Mitchell WerBell. It says, the Wizard of Silent Death. This is the man who makes the silencers, the M10 machine guns, and so forth. The Wizard of Silent Death is sitting with the Pearl of Pearls, His Majesty, the pretender to the throne in Afghanistan. The article says, a king and a wizard in waiting, an Afghan exile and his military advisors have their hopes. And it shows a man who's been deposed since he was a couple of months old or 2 years old from Afghanistan, sitting with Mitchell WerBell, who's been made a royal free commander of the Royal Free Afghan Army. And WerBell is training this person in his school in Georgia to go back and fight in Afghanistan, and he's been promised a seat on the throne. We are planning to go to Chaman, and that's off the record, the wizard said. He's known as Mitchell Livingston WerBell III, founder and director of Cobra International, an anti-terrorist training center located in Atlanta, Georgia, on 66 wooded and rolling acres. WerBell, I've talked about him many, many times, working with Turple, Corcola, Samuel Cummings, the CIA, arming the world, and he works with the anti-Castro Cubans. They're involved in killing Letelier and Sandra Moffat, fighting the military junta in Chile, and I believed often that his silencers could have been used at Dealey Plaza, that in all the information written about the assassinations, there isn't a single book, and I have every book on the assassinations, and correct me if I'm wrong, there isn't a single book that bothers to speak about the fact that silencers could be used at Dealey Plaza. Mitchell WerBell works with all the assassination teams of the Nixon, E. Howard Hunt, Watergate, the group that was arrested at Watergate, that goes back to the counterintelligence group and started after World War II. Mitchell WerBell, he gives them silencers and weapons and goes all over Rhodesia, Southeast Asia, and so forth. Well, he's got His Majesty King Durrani with him. He's made Mitchell WerBell a lieutenant general and commander of the Royal Free Afghan Army. Now, Mitchell WerBell is a white Russian, a czarist. He wants to invade Russia. They need Afghanistan to circle Russia. That's why the Soviet Union took Afghanistan, is that the United States is arming Afghanistan and China and the borders to enclose them. And Mitchell WerBell not only is a lieutenant general of the Royal Free Afghan Army, he's been given the Order of the Brilliant Sun. You have to see this paper, and many of you know what a slob he is, with his huge dogs and training centers. And he's hoping, according to this account, and we know, he's hoping to get the monarchies whipped up and to arm them with everything necessary to take Afghanistan. He says that he will work with the monarchies. He says, we have the monarchies in our corner. Monaco, the Council of Princes in Europe, the Monarchist League, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. And I've mentioned many times that the monarchies are waiting to get back on the throne. Whatever is left of them, they're just a few in number, but they're very well funded and financed, and they sit in the background, the pretenders of every throne, hoping that they can get their seat back. In the meantime, His Majesty Durrani sells cosmetics and perfume for Revlon and Machiavelli scents, and WerBell has accepted Jesus as his savior, and they're waiting for the operation, and they're sending over their weapons, their counter-intrusion system they're arming for Afghanistan, and their computer display, and it will have number and location of weapons and anyone who comes near Durrani. This pretender, the throne left when he was 2 years old. He has somebody competing with him for the throne of Afghanistan. It's similar to the United States putting the Shah in Iran after his father was there and kicked out. We put the Shah in, and this guy is sitting with the monarchies, armed by Mitchell WerBell, who's been active in every counterintelligence operation that ever went against the people. And they're depending on Ronald Reagan to make war in Afghanistan. The article says they're waiting for Ronald Reagan to push them forward. Now, what they want and what they get are two different things. If the CIA pushes Mitchell WerBell and this character into Afghanistan, Russia may just come back and counteract with stronger troops or even atomic weapons. This is going to be an interesting series of years, with the moral majority pushing Reagan one way, the mob wanting favors and nightclub licenses the other, private armies such as Mitchell WerBell's funded by the CIA making their little private wars, and Ronald Reagan sitting back there blowing balloons and chewing jelly beans. It's going to be a great year. We're going to have good cartoons again. Saturday Night Live had a picture of the Reagan entourage going somewhere in limousines, and there's Nancy and Ronald, and behind them is the hairdresser, and behind them is the decorator, and behind them are the entourage of help that supply them, the barber, and so forth. And we're going to get some really good humor because the inconsistencies of this hollow man, propped up by a whole history of political assassinations that has literally robbed us of our choices, is upstaged now. He's in the White House with that silly grin and a lot of excuses if he's pushed against the wall. And it's going to be very interesting to watch Ronald Reagan and Nancy as they prance about. They have the place, and there are a lot of people that don't like them, that realize how tacky and empty they are. There's a lot of society people that will be around them because he's the president. And then there's a lot of people that will show up when he's no longer there that will be the right-hand people of George Bush. Right now they're in the backgrounds waiting, and they will surface very quickly and have prominence again as they have the CIA then in the throne, and you have George Bush taking over from Reagan. Just briefly, we just have about 4 more minutes. I want to tell you about a book. I mentioned it just briefly and put the address and the title on the sheet that went out with the tapes last week. It's called In Search of the Lindbergh Baby. Is Lindbergh's Kidnapped Baby Son Still Alive? This is put out by Tower Paperback Books. It is a paperback. The author is Theon Wright. And again, another subterfuge. There's so many cases, you wonder how far back does it go or where does it end? But there is another paperback published 31 years ago by Quentin Reynolds. He's a lawyer, a writer, about another lawyer, Judge Samuel Leibowitz, and it's about famous cases. It's a paperback called Courtroom. It was put out in 1950. It was only 50 cents. And it goes into the Lindbergh kidnapping and the, as I mentioned before, trying to force a confession of a lawyer, and how Randolph Hearst put up the $50,000 ransom, and how there were allegations it involved the Purple Gang and organized crime, and that there was no way that Bruno Hauptmann could have done it alone. And a lot of the conviction was based upon handwriting and ransom notes, and the misspelling of the words was identical to the kind of diary that Lee Harvey Oswald had. And the expert in the case that helped convict Hauptmann was this Osborne, who later went on with certainty and said that Howard Hughes had written memos in 1972 without any doubt, and later Clifford Irving went to jail, and the book and story Hoax tells about it. The world's experts were wrong about the Howard Hughes handwriting and memos that were sent. They were forged, but the same man that said that the Lindbergh notes were accurate said the Hughes notes were accurate. So if he was wrong with one, he could be wrong with the other. As a matter of fact, the woman who owned the Hope Diamond was so anxious to cash in her diamond to help find the kidnappers, Mrs. Evelyn Walsh McLean. She was a millionaire, a social leader in Washington, D.C., and she claimed that Gaston Means, a member of the Department of Justice, was in touch with the actual kidnappers and pawned the Hope Diamond at one time because she felt that organized crime was involved and that it wasn't a Lindbergh baby, and that baby was alive, wasn't killed, and they'd used another baby. So in 1950, there was a book out saying that multimillionaire in Washington and the Justice Department was involved, and the evidence was all half-cocked, and even if Hauptmann was involved, he couldn't possibly have done it alone. And the same people, Randolph Hearst, who put up the money there, the organized crime, run through these stories of other espionage mysteries. And I think the only solution someday that I'm working on is to get a computer and see how many names and incidences run through these episodes, whether it's the Lindbergh story, whether it's the Howard Hughes story, whether it's the Oswald diary. They found a formula, and it worked, and the people believed it. And when you put together old books, whether written 30 years ago or current books, or the Warren Commission report 17 years ago, or current stuff, it seems that the same people were using the same subterfuge, and that has worked and kept them in power, and they do have the power. Well, this was a bad inauguration year. It's over. We'll go on to better things next week. We'll continue to expose these frauds. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'm sure I'll be back next Sunday. No more substitutes unless I can guarantee that they are really good, and hopefully maybe work with me, but not pull something like we had last week. You take care. This is Mae, and I'll be back with you next week.
Thank you very much. That's World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, a regular feature here on KLRB Sunday nights at 10. It's 1 minute after 11 o'clock. We're KLRB, Carmel, Monterey. Good evening.